Time to start the third and last session today in this emotional balance part of the program. And we're going to talk a lot about the integration of these four types of mental balance, how to do that effectively. Let's have a look at what we're covering in this session. We'll start with a meditation called Glen, giving and taking, which is effectively bringing together the two practices of loving kindness and compassion that we've just done. And so if you were just to do one practice within the compassion wing, within these four immeasurables, then this Glen practice would cover a lot of bases. So this one practice, I think, is very powerful in terms of the emotional balance part of the training. Then we'll look at how to overcome low self-esteem, again, relating to this topic of cognitive fusion that we just looked at. Then following that, a summary of the main elements of the four types of mental balance in this program. Then look at how an integrated approach is going to be very essential in terms of striving for that mental balance and well-being. And then we'll do a meditation on cultivating this view of genuine happiness. And then we're looking at how to integrate some of these practices into daily life, question answer, and then finish with a dedication. So let's begin with that Glen practice. Find a nice, comfortable posture. Let's begin. We begin by establishing a good posture. So keeping the back nice and straight. And at the same time, allow the entire body to become completely relaxed. Using the out-breath to relax and release any tightness or tension in any part of the body. And with each out-breath, letting go of any thoughts that may have arisen, happily releasing them. And allowing the mind to come to rest in the stillness of the present moment. Glen is a Tibetan word which literally means giving and taking. It's a very powerful method to transform our selfish, self-cherishing attitude into an attitude of cherishing others, to transform our attachment and aversion into loving kindness and compassion. And again, we can begin by using this Glen practice to first cultivate loving kindness and compassion for ourselves, and then expand out to others. And again, we begin by imagining the inner purity of our mind, a level of our mind untouched by any of the mental afflictions. To imagine this in the form of a small, white, radiant sphere of light in the center of your chest at the level of your heart. And arouse the thought, how wonderful it would be if I were free of suffering and its causes. May I be free of all suffering and its causes. May I be free of all mental afflictions. And then bring to mind one mental affliction that really causes you a lot of suffering. One mental affliction that you'd really like to reduce and eliminate. Maybe it's anger or jealousy or anxiety or craving. And imagine this mental affliction in the form of black smoke filling your body. And then with each in-breath, imagine drawing that black smoke into the sphere of light at your heart, completely dissolving it there. So with each in-breath, breathe in with compassion, dissolving and extinguishing this mental affliction at your heart, dissolving it into the inner purity of your mind, your inner wisdom. And then imagine the black cloud is now completely extinguished. And now you're completely free of that mental affliction. And simply rest in that freedom. Rest in that purity of mind. And arouse the thought, how wonderful it would be if I had happiness and its causes. May I be truly well and happy. And then bring to mind one positive quality that you would really like to cultivate and fully possess. And then with each out-breath, breathe out the light of loving kindness, sending to yourself whatever you need to cultivate this quality. And then imagine you've now fully cultivated that quality. And simply rest in that quality. And now allow your field of loving kindness and compassion to expand out further. And allow your mind to move around. And whoever comes to mind, whether it's a friend, a stranger, or even a difficult person, attend to them. May you be free of all suffering and its causes. And may you be truly well and happy. And breathing in with compassion, dissolving and extinguishing their suffering at your heart, and breathing out the light of loving kindness, sending to them whatever they need to be happy. And allow your mind to continue to move around. And whoever comes to mind, whether it's an individual or even a group of people, attend to them. Breathing in with compassion, breathing out the light of loving kindness. No matter how much darkness is drawn in, it is all extinguished without a trace. And no matter how much light is sent out, it is sent out from an inexhaustible source that is in no way depleted. Allowing the mind to continue to move around. Breathing in with compassion, breathing out the light of loving kindness. And then release all appearances and allow the mind to come to rest. To rest in that inner purity of mind. Which is in the nature of loving kindness and compassion. And we can bring the meditation to a close. Why is there so much low self-esteem and self-hatred in our modern world? And I think one of the main reasons is that we tend to have this obsessive focus on the negative in the modern world. And we tend to do that with cognitive fusion. So again, as we saw in the previous session, if we have engaged in some harmful behavior, the correct perspective is simply acknowledge I did or engaged in this harmful, bad action. That's the correct perspective. But often we don't have that perspective. We have a different perspective. And our perspective is, oh, I'm just such a bad person. I'm a horrible person, nasty person. And what we've done again here is we've fused ourselves with our behavior. We've made them one thing. And again, this is a false, invalid perspective because there are two things here. There's a person and behavior. It's not one thing. But if we do this cognitive fusion with respect to ourselves and our bad behavior and see ourselves as a bad person, again, what we do is reject with cognitive fusion translates into rejecting ourselves. We attack ourselves. We hate ourselves. We get angry at ourselves. And then we feel guilt. Guilt is coming from cognitive fusion. Because when we feel guilty, what are we focusing on? Bad me, bad me. And so guilt comes from a false, invalid perspective. So we don't need to feel guilty about anything. Whereas if we've done something harmful and we regret, what are we focusing on? The bad behavior. So regret comes from a correct perspective, simply acknowledging I have done this bad action. And then instead of getting angry at ourselves, rejecting ourselves, we can accept ourselves, have compassion for ourselves, and regret our behavior and look at ways of overcoming the negative behavior. Whereas if we do the cognitive fusion, then what we do is we judge and criticize ourselves, we condemn ourselves, we hate ourselves, and then we end up with a fixed, biased view of ourselves. I'm such a bad person. And then, yes, we will, of course, because of that, end up with low self-esteem and self-hatred. So the solution to that is don't do cognitive fusion. And that is simply adopt the correct perspective, acknowledge I have done this bad action. Then we can accept ourselves, have forgiveness and compassion for ourselves, and at the same time not tolerate our negative behavior and regret our negative behavior. We evaluate our negative behavior, seeing that it's harmful, and then we regret that negative behavior and then look at ways of overcoming that negative behavior. So then we can have good self-esteem, have a balanced view of ourselves, and then address our negative behavior. And so then what is the solution to low self-esteem and self-hatred? Is it simply to reinforce that instead of I'm a bad person, I'm a good person? As actually I think some modern therapies do that. I think there's a big danger in that. Because if we simply reinforce I'm a good person, that's still cognitive fusion. We are identifying with our good behavior. And so the danger with that is then it can become a bit of an ego trip. I'm such a good person. In fact, I'm better than everyone else. In fact, I'm one of these good guys. They're the bad guys over there. So let's get rid of those bad guys over there. And then because we're such a good person, then sometimes we can't even acknowledge our bad behavior, because I'm a good person, so everything I do must be good. But then when we come to see through that and understand that we are not such a good person, then it just reinforces the fact that I must be really a bad person. So the solution to low self-esteem and self-hatred is not really to say I'm a good person, but rather to avoid cognitive fusion. If we avoid cognitive fusion, to avoid wrongly identifying ourselves with our negative behavior, then we can have good self-esteem and at the same time address any negative behavior that we engage in, not tolerate any negative behavior. So good self-esteem comes from correct perspective, not by wrongly doing cognitive fusion by saying I'm a good person. That can lead to these potential problems. So rather, to simply avoid the cognitive fusion, because then we can really still have good self-esteem. We can accept ourselves, forgiveness and compassion for ourselves, but at the same time not tolerate any negative behavior, address our negative behavior, regret any negative behavior, and overcome any negative behavior. So this is going to be a way to really develop sustainable, good self-esteem by simply avoiding cognitive fusion. And focus on the positive aspects of ourselves and others, of course. So let's go to summarizing what we've covered in the last 3 weekends then. Again, we're using this article from Alan Wallace and Shauna Shapiro, where they introduce this fourfold model of mental balance and well-being. We saw that in each of those 3 areas, they introduced these 3 types of imbalance, of deficit, hyperactivity, dysfunction. And that first we start with motivational balance, because that gives us direction for the other 3. Then we engage in attentional balance training to be able to have an effective basis for engaging in cognitive and emotional balance. Or from a Buddhist perspective, in Buddhist training, first we establish a foundation in the preliminary practices. On that basis, we engage in shamatha practice to have a foundation for the 2 main wings of practice of wisdom and compassion, or vipassana and compassion. And here we saw that motivational balance entails intentions and volitions that are conducive to one's own and others' well-being. So reality-based desires and intentions. And we saw here how to overcome the imbalances of deficit, hyperactivity, dysfunction. In terms of deficit, to understand that there is the reality of change and that it is possible to generate well-being. Hyperactivity, to let go of obsessive desire by cultivating of contentment. But at the deeper level, the dysfunction, to really see experientially the true causes of suffering and well-being, that they're not anywhere out there to be found, they lie within ourselves. And so if we can really cultivate that, then we have a good basis for the other 3 types of mental balance. And we saw that this is actualized in Buddhism through the preliminary practices, through these 4 thoughts that turn the mind. First, to reflect on our precious human life, to develop an aspiration to make our life meaningful, and then to reflect on death and impermanence, to understand this opportunity we have is not going to last forever. So to really have an aspiration to make our life meaningful right now. How to make our life meaningful at a foundation level, reflecting on causality of our actions, understanding harmful actions lead to suffering, beneficial actions lead to happiness, and so therefore adopt an ethical lifestyle. So this is really the foundation for meaningful life. But then to go one step further, and then again to reflect on the suffering and its causes, happiness and its causes, to really understand that the underlying source of both genuine happiness and suffering come from within our own mind, and then develop that view of genuine happiness. That will give us then the direction for the other 3 areas of mental balance. And so the second level of the second type of mental balance to engage in, attentional balance. Again, here the ability to sustain voluntary flow of attention, with a quality of awareness effused by ease, focus, and clarity. In other words, to cultivate a calm, clear, focused mind. And we saw there that in the 3 types of imbalance, the 2 main ones here that we're looking at were deficit, meaning dullness or laxity, not seeing things clearly; hyperactivity, where our mind is aroused and agitated, caught up in all sorts of distractions or excitation. And that the third type, dysfunction, is when we look at things in an afflictive ways. That's really dealt with in terms, particularly in the cognitive and emotional balance training. So here, the two main imbalances are the dullness, distraction, or laxity and excitation. And we overcome those through cultivating mindfulness, strengthening our mindfulness. And then together with that, the second tool of introspection here called meta attention, this quality control, noticing if we're becoming dull or distracted, and then fixing that, reapplying mindfulness. And so this is really how we can develop that attentional balance through strengthening, cultivating our mindfulness, overcoming these two imbalances. And we saw here that in this shamatha training, that particularly for us in the modern world, the basis is relaxation, that we tend to bring a lot of tension, agitation, tension. We tend to push hard when we do things. And if we try to do that in this attentional balance training, we bring a lot of tension in there and we push hard, we're going to have all sorts of problems. So the first step, basis of relaxation, to release that tightness and tension. And then we develop those two qualities of stability and clarity, overcoming the two imbalances of dullness and distraction. And the article, and we do that by focusing on an object. And here the article said that one of the most widespread objects used in Buddhist practice for shamatha is mindfulness of breathing, particularly good for if we have a lot of discursive thinking, a lot of obsessive compulsive thinking that many of us have in the modern world. So mindfulness of breathing, very good object to use, to focus on that. And we saw there 3 variations, very helpful. Full body practice, noticing sensations throughout the body, very good for relaxation. Focusing on the abdomen, they're very good for improving stability of attention. And then focusing entrance nostrils, very good for enhancing clarity of attention. So doing this shamatha practice, mindfulness of breathing, we can then cultivate mindfulness, strengthen mindfulness, and thereby, with the help of introspection, quality control, we can start to overcome more and more subtle levels of both dullness and distraction, or laxity and excitation, the two main imbalances, and thereby cultivate a calm, clear, focused mind, develop this attentional balance. And then on the basis of attentional balance, we can effectively engage in both cognitive and emotional balance. And again, here we saw cognitive balance is basically to see reality clearly without projecting, exaggerating, distorting reality. And here the 3 imbalances, the deficit is not seeing clearly what's actually there. Hyperactivity means projecting a lot of things on top of reality that aren't there. And then dysfunction is misapprehending things based on both deficit and hyperactivity. And we saw there 4 main ways in which we distort reality. And the one we really looked at in some detail was to overcome grasping onto independent me, independent world, to really come to realize that everything we see and experience is interdependent. And we do this through Vipassana practice, that we apply the mindfulness that we've gained through cultivating mindfulness in the shamatha practice. We apply that mindfulness here in Vipassana, investigate body, feelings, mind, phenomena, to come to these insights, impermanence, suffering, no self, and at the deeper level, to come to this insight into emptiness, that nothing exists independently. And through this Vipassana practice, then we can really start to overcome mental afflictions and suffering, achieve liberation from suffering. And now in this session, we've looked at emotional balance. And we saw again the 3 types of imbalance here: deficit, apathy, indifference, hyperactivity, this oscillating between elation, depression, hope, fear, infatuation, aversion, and so forth. And then dysfunction is to inappropriate emotions, reacting inappropriately in situations. And then we achieve that emotional balance through being aware of our own and others' emotions, behaviors, triggers as they arise, and then making wise choices when engaging with emotional experience, meaning instead of reacting with things like attachment, aversion, jealousy, we respond with loving kindness and compassion and so forth. And so we saw here that in terms of overcoming these imbalances, we looked in this, the article talks about, one was talking about these four immeasurables, cultivating these four qualities of loving kindness, compassion, joy, and equanimity, but also then to overcome emotional imbalances by counteracting directly mental afflictions. And here we looked at particularly the mental afflictions of attachment and anger. And so in terms of dealing with these mental afflictions, we can use more or less the same approach with all mental afflictions. Specific mental afflictions have sort of specific antidotes, but the general approach we would adopt would be the same for all mental afflictions. First, understand clearly what that mental affliction is and how it leads to suffering, and thereby develop the aspiration to be free of it. And then, again, essential, cultivating this view of genuine happiness through motivational balance, through the preliminary practices. Again, as long as we feel like the source of my happiness and suffering is coming from out there, then mental afflictions will naturally follow, because we'll have attachment to pleasant, aversion to unpleasant, and all the other mental afflictions come out of those. So if we can really cultivate that view of genuine happiness, that motivational balance through those preliminary practices, then we can really start to effectively deal with mental afflictions. And again, the first step in being able to deal with mental afflictions as they're arising, mindfulness. Without having strengthened our mindfulness, cultivated mindfulness through attentional balance training, through the shamatha practice, then we're just going to get caught up in mental afflictions. We're going to keep reacting. We're not going to be able to deal with them. So we need to have more mindfulness so that we can catch mental afflictions early as they're arising before they can take control of our mind. Because if we can see mental afflictions early, we can simply observe them, then we're free of them. Then they have no power to harm us. Because if we look at any mental affliction from its own side, they're virtually nothing. They have no power to harm us. Mental afflictions only have power to harm us if we give them power. And we give them power either by identifying with them and getting caught up in them, or trying to suppress them. Then they have a lot of power. So if we try to fight with mental afflictions, or we allow ourselves to get caught up in mental afflictions, then they have a lot of power to harm us. Then we'll have more mental afflictions and suffering. So all we need to do here is step back and watch. And if we can watch those mental afflictions, we're free of them. They can't go anywhere. They'll simply dissipate by themselves. Very effective in dealing with mental afflictions. But again, it will only start to become possible if we've cultivated more mindfulness through attentional balance training. In addition to simply observing mental afflictions, we can apply antidotes. And what we've seen here is a lot of the antidotes for mental afflictions are coming from the cognitive balance training, the Vipassana wings, such as the impermanence and the emptiness, that if we can really start to cultivate experientially impermanence and emptiness and so forth through the cognitive balance training, then we can start to apply them here when we notice mental afflictions arising, to dissipate those mental afflictions as an effective antidote to the mental afflictions. So what we've seen here in terms of dealing with mental afflictions within the emotional balance training, then to be able to effectively do that, we need an integrated approach. We need to engage in those three other areas of practice: the motivational balance, the attentional balance, and cognitive balance training. And so then we can have an effective approach for dealing with mental afflictions. And so let's go to that integrated approach now. So we saw before that first we engage in motivational balance to get the direction. Then on that basis, we engage in attentional balance training to cultivate a more calm, clear, focused mind. On that basis, we can effectively engage in those two wings of the cognitive balance, emotional balance training. But it's not just a one-way street. It's not serial, even though there is some sequence of emphasis. But it doesn't mean that we first need to engage in preliminaries and motivational, get that fully done, tick. Then we go to attentional balance training, shamatha practice, fully develop mindfulness, tick, and then we engage in those two wings. That won't, in fact, that won't work. Because even when we start to work on a motivational balance, and maybe we need to emphasize that first, to really be able to fully develop that, we need help from the other three areas of practice. So to fully develop any one of these four areas, we need help from the other three. And so that's what the article was saying here. It says, all the components of the model are interconnected. The model represents a systemic and dynamic process of evolving toward well-being. Therefore, although we describe each of the mental balances below as individual factors, it is important to note that as balance is gained in one area, it affects the other three. So if we want an effective practice or effective way of cultivating any one of these four, we need to pay attention to the other three as well. So let's have a look at how that works a little bit. So again, motivational balance, preliminary practices. And here the article says that if we don't start to develop that cognitive balance, then there will be little or no incentive to try to balance one's attentional, cognitive, affective faculties. So we need to start with motivational balance to start there, because if we don't start to work on the preliminaries, the motivational balance, then we're not going to have any incentive to engage in attentional, cognitive, and emotional balance, because we'll be too busy chasing after all those sensory things, all those things out there that seem to be giving us happiness, and trying to avoid all those things out there that seem to make us suffer. And so therefore we'll end up in the situation, the Shanti Dev, if we don't cultivate emotional balance, then as he says, those desiring to escape from suffering hasten right toward their own misery, and with a very desire for happiness, out of delusion, they destroy their own well-being as if it were the enemy. So again, even though we want to be happy, want to be free of suffering, we're just going to create more suffering. And that's a little bit, unfortunately, what happens in the modern world, is that within these four elements in the modern world, what has really become very popular is within attentional balance training, mindfulness. And so what we find is that often mindfulness is taken out of that and presented separately as even almost like a magic pill. Here's magic pill of mindfulness. You take that, all your problems will go away. In fact, they won't go away. You may even have more problems, because if we have a dysfunctional lifestyle, if we haven't fixed our motivational balance, we haven't got a healthy aspirations, if we don't have reality-based aspirations for our own and others' happiness, and we're not engaging in some cognitive and emotional balance training, then, and we just apply mindfulness on the basis of a dysfunctional life. For example, we may just get better at cheating and deceiving people, and then we're just going to end up with more suffering. And so, and this is what we find in Attention Revolution, the reading for the attentional balance training, Alan Wallace, he says exactly this. He says, there's a strong tendency to take our current way of life as the norm, and then add meditation to fix it, like a Band-Aid applied to a festering wound. It won't work unless we fixed our worldview. And often our worldview now is the source of my happiness and suffering is out there. And it's all about what happens to me. And therefore pleasure is happiness and pain is suffering. And it's all about what we can get from the world. And because of that, we end up with a lot of attachment to pleasure and a lot of aversion to pain. And then when it comes to meditate, we're going to be very lazy. No time to meditate. I'm too busy chasing after these things and trying to avoid these things out there. And then if we do meditate and engage in this attentional balance training, and just try to cultivate a little bit of mindfulness, then we're going to end up with what's called, someone coined the term McMindfulness. In other words, the McDonald's of mindfulness, fast food mindfulness, not healthy at all, because there's no framework around it. And then, as that, like Alan Wallace says, if we simply add meditation to fix our dysfunctional life, we just add a little bit of mindfulness somehow to soothe our dysfunctional life, then it's like putting a Band-Aid on a festering wound. It's not fixing any problems at all. It may just make things worse. So therefore, we need to fix our worldview to really come to see that the source of happiness and suffering is not anywhere outside, it lies within our own mind. And it's not so much then what happens to us, it's how we respond to what happens to us. And then we'll really understand that pleasure is not the same as happiness and pain is not the same as suffering. And then it's not so much about what we can get from the world, it's what we can bring to the world. And then we'll, instead of reacting with attachment and aversion and anger and hostility, we'll respond with loving kindness and compassion. And then we'll have a lot of enthusiasm to meditate, because we'll see particularly this attention balance training is the gateway to genuine happiness. Because on that basis of attentional balance training, we can effectively also engage in cognitive and emotional balance. And then with all of these four together, then we can really strive for that genuine happiness and inner well-being. And then in an attentional balance, if we don't engage in attentional balance training, as we saw earlier, it's going to be very difficult to cultivate cognitive and emotional balance, because our mind won't be calm, clear, focused. For cognitive balance, to be able to fully penetrate, to see clearly nature of reality, we need a calm, clear, focused mind. And also to effectively cultivate the positive qualities of loving kindness and compassion, we need a calm, clear, focused mind. So if we don't engage in that shamatha practice, it's going to be very difficult to engage in the wisdom, the vipassana practice, or the compassion practice. And as we saw just now, if we don't have that motivational balance, then our shamatha practice will just become this sort of mindfulness, this fast food mindfulness, because we won't have a healthy direction, no framework for that. But then if we do have motivational balance, have a good direction, and we engage in shamatha practice, but then we don't start to also engage in the cognitive and emotional balance training, then you're going to find it very difficult to make progress or significant progress in attentional balance training, because mental afflictions are going to create problems. And remember, we can start to subdue mental afflictions through both the vipassana, through the attention, the cognitive balance, and the emotional balance training. So if we start to engage in the attentional balance training, the shamatha practice, on the basis of the motivational balance, the healthy direction, we start to engage in that shamatha practice, but then also we start to add some emotional balance training and cognitive balance training, then they're going to have a positive impact on our attentional balance training, because those two wings are going to start to subdue the mental afflictions, which means it's going to be easier for us to go deeper and deeper in attentional balance training. And then in terms of cognitive balance or vipassana practice, again, if we don't have attentional balance, then, or if we don't have motivational balance, there's probably no interest in doing any cognitive balance training, because we'll be too busy chasing after things out there. And if we don't have any attentional balance, then how are we going to gain insights? How are we going to see reality clearly? Because our mind is not calm, clear, focused. We're not going to make much progress in the cognitive balance, the vipassana practice. But equally well, if we don't have any emotional balance training to supplement the cognitive balance, in other words, if we simply engage in wisdom without compassion, then often what happens is we can become very self-absorbed, we can become very disconnected, insensitive to sufferings of others, and even in extreme cases become unethical, because we may believe that we're doing some high level of Vipassana practice. So everything I do is with wisdom. So everything I do is okay. And we become very unethical. So this can happen if we don't engage also in the emotional balance training, the compassion side of the practice. And if we engage in the cognitive balance training, the Vipassana practice, then that's going to really deepen our insights into the view of genuine happiness, motivational balance. It will help with the shamatha practice in terms of subduing mental afflictions, and it will also help in the emotional balance training as well. And then lastly, in the emotional balance, in the compassion practice, again, if we have no motivational balance, we're probably not going to be engaging in any emotional balance training, because again, we'll be too busy chasing after all those things out there that seem to make us happy and avoiding those things out there that seem to give us suffering. Again, no attentional balance training. It's going to be very difficult to cultivate emotional balance. It's very difficult to really fully develop the loving kindness and compassion, because our mind is not calm, clear, focused in development of those qualities. And also, if we're not engaging in supplementing the emotional balance with the cognitive balance, i.e., if we're trying to engage in compassion without the wisdom side of the practice, then we're not often in touch with reality. And then our compassion can become biased. We'll help these people because they're nice people, they deserve help. But those people over here, horrible, nasty people, won't help them. I hope they suffer because they're nasty people. But then also without that, without seeing reality clearly, then we can end up doing things that not only don't help, but can create suffering. So we can end up with, even with the best motivation in the world to help, we can end up just creating more suffering because we don't have that cognitive balance. We're not seeing reality clearly. And then we can end up with what's called burnout, compassion burnout, that without that cognitive balance of knowing what we can do to help, what we can't do to help, knowing when to rest and look after ourselves, we can burn out. And then also we can get taken advantage of. And that's happened for many of us many times, is we try to help people and then they take advantage of us. Again, a classic example of a lack of cognitive balance, a lack of insight. Because if we are allowing people to take advantage of us, then we're allowing them to engage in harmful behavior. That's the opposite of compassion. So the wisdom there is the wisdom understanding that not to allow that to happen and to really be firm about that negative behavior, not, of course, doing cognitive fusion, attacking the person, but not tolerating negative behavior. And so then if we engage in emotional balance training, that will also help us to deepen all three other areas of this training, of motivational balance, attentional balance, and cognitive balance. And so that's what we'd like to do now. I'd like to go to a meditation where we go back to the foundation, to really, in that foundation of motivational balance, to really start to cultivate this view of genuine happiness. And that on that basis, then, to be able to engage more effectively in terms of attentional balance, cognitive balance, emotional balance as well. So really covering all those four areas to cultivate that view. So let's do that meditation now. Setting the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. allowing the breathing to settle into its natural rhythm. Allowing the breathing to flow naturally and effortlessly. And allowing the mind to come to rest in the stillness of the present moment. We all want to be happy, and we all want to be free of suffering. And it often seems to us as if the source of our happiness and the source of our suffering is out there in the world. And as a result, one of the main methods we use to try to find happiness and to overcome suffering is that we try to manipulate the things around us. We try to attract people, places, and things that seem to be the source of our happiness. And we try to push away or avoid people, places, and things that seem to be the source of our suffering. However, is this an effective strategy? Using this strategy, are we getting any closer to overcoming suffering and achieving genuine happiness? No matter how hard we try to control and manipulate the things around us, we still seem to encounter suffering. And we're still chasing after that elusive happiness. All that we're really achieving through this method is that we are trapping ourselves in the hope-fear cycle. Hoping for pleasant experiences and fearing or worrying about unpleasant experiences. And if we don't get the things we want, we often become frustrated. And even if we do get the things we want, They never really fully satisfy us, and we simply end up craving for more. And we often end up with a lot of dissatisfaction and disappointment when things don't live up to our expectations. So, what's the solution? According to Buddhism, we're simply looking in the wrong place. What would happen if we instead turned our attention to our own mind? And what would happen if we began to cultivate more mindfulness? If we developed a more calm, clear, and focused mind? And what would happen if we could begin to see things more clearly and accurately without projecting or distorting what we apprehend? And instead of reacting to things out of old habits, we could instead begin to respond in ways more conducive to our own and others' happiness. And what would happen if we began to reduce our mental afflictions, such as craving and attachment, anger and jealousy, fear and anxiety? And we began to cultivate loving kindness and compassion for ourselves and others. And what would happen if we could begin to see difficult situations in our life as opportunities for growth and development, rather than seeing them as problems or obstacles? So let's set a positive motivation, a motivation of wishing to discover practical methods to overcome our own mental afflictions and suffering, and to find genuine happiness and well-being. And we can extend that motivation out to also include others, also wishing to help those around us to overcome mental afflictions and suffering and find genuine happiness. And then release all appearances and allow the mind to come to rest in that inner purity of mind. Free of the mental afflictions. And in the nature of loving kindness and compassion. And we can bring the meditation to a close. So let's briefly look at how to integrate all of this into daily life before we go to question and answer. So what we've seen here is that in terms of training our mind, the importance of cultivating all four types of mental balance, of the motivational, attentional, cognitive, and emotional. Or in other words, from a Buddhist perspective, if we really want to strive for genuine happiness and liberation from suffering, we need to cover all four areas of practice of the preliminaries, the shamatha, vipassana, and compassion. That if we leave out any one of those four, we're really making it very difficult for us to make effective progress in training the mind and following the spiritual path. Key to progress is continuity. So training the mind on a daily basis, meaning meditating daily and integrating what we meditate on into daily life. But also very helpful on a regular basis, at least maybe annually, every year, to go to a meditation retreat. And as in the beginning phases, group retreat, because it's easier, it's guided, and you have structure. It can really give us a boost in our practice and give us a lot of inspiration as well. So that's very helpful for that purpose. And then in terms of applying effort, to always maintain a joyful mind. That, you know, if we see spiritual practice as some sort of hardship that we have to endure, we've completely missed the point. That in fact, effort in Buddhism is a mind that delights in virtue, a mind that's happy to do good things. And so it's all down to motivation. So again, if we engage in those preliminary practices, really establish that view of genuine happiness, then we can really have a joyful mind, because all the things we do then are helping us to move towards that state of genuine happiness and inner well-being. And when we're faced with difficult situations, then having on the basis of the view of genuine happiness, if we have the view that source of happiness and suffering is out there, then when we're faced with difficult situations, then we're going to definitely see them as problems or obstacles, and we'll have aversion, and that will just create much more suffering for us. Whereas if we have a view of genuine happiness, it's not about what we can get from the world, what we can bring to the world. Then when we're faced with difficulties, we'll be able to see them as opportunities. And we know from our own experience that the times where we most progressed as a person, most developed as a person in our life, is not when things were going well. When things go well in our life, we tend to float along and not really develop as a person. It's only when we're challenged, we're faced with difficulties that challenge us, that we really develop as a person. So to really see difficulties in our life as opportunities, and then instead of reacting to those with aversion and so forth, to respond with loving kindness and compassion. And in terms of training the mind, I can't overemphasize the importance of Sangha, of like-minded friends, that we need help to do this training, because we now have a lot of bad habits. We're easily influenced by others, and we're trying to move in a new, better direction in our life. It's like swimming upstream against the current, not easy as a beginner. So therefore, we need help. We need to get connected with like-minded people, get supported, support them. Then we can start to make some progress in our practice. If we have this attitude, I can do it by myself, then my experience in talking to many people is that that's very difficult as a beginner. Once we get more established in the practice, we develop new habits and so forth, then yes, we can do things more independently because we have more capacity. But as a beginner, we need a lot of help. So find these friends and get connected and help each other. And then in terms of how to actually integrate into sort of a daily life. So just to go through how to bring some of these ideas into our daily life. Start the day, good motivation. And one here I like, from a quote from His Holiness Dalai Lama, I really like. Every day, think as you wake up, I'm going to benefit others as much as I can. I think this very expansive motivation, very, very helpful, particularly when we're faced with difficulties in our life. If our motivation is only based on ourselves, then it's much more likely we'll just sort of give up when we're faced with difficulties. Whereas if our motivation is including others, I'm doing this for others as well, we're more likely to persevere in the face of difficulties. Much more powerful, expansive motivation. And then in terms of daily meditation practice, best to do it in the morning. And what we've seen here is that the attentional balance training is very essential, particularly for us in the modern world, where we tend to have very chaotic minds and our attentional skills are very poor. So I think for many of us initially to emphasize the shamatha practice, the attentional balance training, and to really calm and focus the mind. But to not just do that as a meditation, but to have this integrated approach, making sure that we are adding elements from the other three areas of practice. So maybe initially, if our mind has got very poor attention skills, we may emphasize the shamatha training, the attentional training a lot, but still adding these other elements in there. And if we're doing like 2 sessions in the morning, maybe with a little short break, 15 minutes break, 15 minutes. Then in the first of the 2 meditation sessions, I would recommend the attentional balance training, calm, clear, focused mind. In the second half, then more analytical, which is the preliminaries, compassion, vipassana. They're all analysis type meditations. If we're only doing 1 session in the morning, then some mornings just doing attentional balance training, on others, a little bit of attention, and then adding one of the other elements. So really always having that balanced approach. And also what we can do is when we're adding these other elements, we can be flexible and sort of see what's going on in our life and which one of those elements we have a lot of imbalance in, a lot of we need to balance in. So we've seen the imbalances in all of those other areas. And so here we can specifically address any of those other areas that are dominating at that particular time of our life, or that particular period of our life. For example, if we're finding that we're very lazy, or we find we're too busy to meditate, then good to add these preliminary practices, particularly precious human life and death. That can help us to overcome laziness or being too busy to meditate and so forth. If we're caught up in low self-esteem and anger and hatred, then really more emphasis on loving kindness and compassion. If we find ourselves caught up in a lot of jealousy or a lot of despair, being overwhelmed by negative things, empathetic joy is a very good practice from the compassion wing. If there's a lot of grasping and attachment, then good to go into the vipassana, the cognitive balance training, particularly these insights into impermanence and emptiness. So these elements that we can add and adjust according to what's going on in our life. If particularly have a strong imbalance in one of those areas, we can add a little bit more of that to balance. But overall, we want to be able to cover all 4 areas of this mental balance training. And then during the day, to continue with cultivating that mindfulness, because it's going to be very essential, as we've seen, with dealing with mental afflictions. Without mindfulness, we won't be able to deal with mental afflictions. We're really stimulus reaction machines, that some stimulus comes, we react out of habit. And so here there's a very nice quote regarding that from Viktor Frankl, who says, between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. But if that space between stimulus and when we're reacting can be very short. If we don't have mindfulness, then we won't be able to choose our response. We'll simply react out of habit. We'll react with attachment, aversion, jealousy, and so forth. But if we can gain access to that space through better mindfulness, then instead of reacting, we can choose our response. Instead of reacting with attachment, aversion, jealousy, we can respond with loving kindness and compassion and wisdom. And there is our growth and our freedom. So very important that we have that improved mindfulness. So to continue not only to engage in attentional balance meditation training, but to continue to cultivate mindfulness through the day. And here we can use triggers to remind us to be mindful. For example, whenever we notice a lot of tension in the day, just stop whatever we're doing and do a little short mindfulness exercise, maybe focusing on the breath for 3 breaths. Or we can use apps to remind us to be mindful, programming them so that they give us a bell maybe once in an hour or something, and then a little mindfulness exercise, or in breaks between activities, or when we're doing certain activities. So using these triggers and start to seed the day with mindfulness. That will help us to be more and more mindful throughout the day, which means then we'll be able to gain access to that space. Instead of stimulus reaction, then we can go into what's called witnessing mode, using this open awareness, just being fully present with whatever's arising. And then we'll have that space between when stimulus comes, and instead of reacting, we will be able to choose our response instead of react out of habit. And we can choose our response of loving kindness and compassion. And then we're free of mental afflictions and we can grow as a person. We can develop the positive qualities. And then also this tong len practice that we did in the beginning of this session, which is a combination of loving kindness and compassion, we can use that effectively, practically in daily life as well. For example, when we see someone else suffering, then on the in-breath, take their suffering, on the out-breath, give them happiness. When we ourselves are suffering, we can take that suffering from others, give them happiness. When we're faced with difficult situations, we're about to enter into maybe a difficult situation with another person. Instead of being on the defensive, and then maybe they say something a little provocative and we react, then as we're approaching that person, on the in-breath, take their suffering, on the out-breath, give them happiness. So then we're more open, more in a state of loving kindness and compassion, rather than in a closed state, in a sort of defensive state. So this tong len practice can be very helpful in continually cultivating loving kindness and compassion throughout the day. But also very important, particularly in our modern world, focus on the positives. We have this obsessive focus on the negative in our modern world, and often with cognitive fusion. So to focus on the positives, this empathetic joy practice of really rejoicing and having joy whenever we see others do something good, or we're doing something good, or something good happens to others. And so really just rejoicing. And then together with that, also to really have this sense of gratitude for the things we receive in our life. We tend to take things for granted, but we receive so much every day. So whenever we receive anything, no matter how small, have a sense of gratitude for receiving that. So really focusing on the positive aspects during the day. That's going to really dramatically shift our perspective of our life as well. And then at the end of the day, if we have time at the end of the day to do a second meditation, then if you're doing 2 meditations, one in the morning, one in the evening, I'd recommend shamatha, attentional balance training in the morning. That's probably most effective. And then in the evening, maybe we're a little bit tired from the day, a little bit more active meditation. So one of the meditations from the other three areas of practice of the preliminaries, compassion, the vipassana practice. And if you want to meditate in the evening, but you're a little bit tired, you can use the shavasana posture, lying on your back to meditate. Very good. And what I would recommend is actually, when we go to bed, two things to do, even if we can't manage to meditate in the evening. When we go to bed, lie down in that shavasana posture, lying flat on the back, and review the day. How did the day go? And then pick one negative thing that we did during the day and purify that by going through these 4 points of having sincere regret for that negative thing. Don't identify with it and just and say, I was such a bad person today and have guilt and so forth, but simply acknowledge I did a harmful behavior, have regret for that negative behavior. And reliance is about reaffirming the positive direction of our life that we want to follow. Remedy, some sort of practical remedy for that negative behavior. And then resolve, make a strong determination not to do that negative behavior the following day. In this way, we can start to reduce negative habits. Similarly, we can increase positive habits by picking one good thing we did during the day, rejoice in that, be happy about having done that, and make a strong resolve, determination to continue that positive behavior the next day. In that way, we can increase positive habits. And again, think of one thing we received during the day and develop a sense of gratitude for having received that. So if we do those three things at the end of every day and keep them short, then that can be a very powerful way of reducing negative habits, increasing positive habits, and really having this sense of gratitude for all the things we receive in our life. And then one last thing we can do when we go to bed is in the shavasana posture, often with our busy lives, even at the end of the day, a lot of things often are churning over in our mind, maybe things we have to do the next day or unfinished business from that day, maybe still a lot of tension in the body. We lie down in bed, we try to sleep, we toss and turn, we can't get to sleep. Go in the shavasana posture, lying flat on your back, and then on every out breath, you just release any tension in the body, releasing any thoughts in the mind. Just keep doing that on every out breath, relaxing, releasing, relaxing, releasing. When you start to mentally get drowsy, just note your meditation's finished and then physically move out of that posture in whatever posture you use for sleep. And so that way, it's a very good way to transition into sleep. So this is a little bit how we can integrate these 4 elements of mental balance and well-being, these 4 types of mental balance that we've looked at in these over these 3 weekends. So that's all I wanted to talk about now. So we've still got some time for question and answer. So if you have any questions, then now's the time to ask them. You can ask about not only what we've done today, but any of these 4 types of mental balance. So do we have any questions?
All right, so we have about 3 questions.
Sure. Okay.
So Sigal is asking why practicing tong Glen is so important.
The tong is what it does is, see, we looked at in the emotional balance training, not only in terms of overcoming mental afflictions, but in terms of those 4 qualities, the 4 core qualities of loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, and equanimity. And these really are the core elements, and each one is a separate practice. And so we can do all 4 practices, and that's very good. But and the question was earlier, what's the shortcut? What's the sort of where, there's all these practices, where do we begin? And what I would recommend is Tonglen, because Tonglen covers loving kindness, compassion, joy, and also equanimity. So all of those areas are really combined into that one practice. And so if you want to keep it simple, but cover all the areas within or most of the areas within the compassion training, the emotional balance training, then that would be a very good practice to engage in, the Tonglen practice. Do we have to engage in Tonglen? No. But would be a sort of a simple approach to cover a lot of the areas or a lot of the various practices that come within the emotional balance training.
All right, so another question. If an integrative approach is recommended, what about the suggestion to engage in a year-long shamatha retreat?
There's a lot to say on that, but maybe we keep it simple. Well, first is that we would only entertain doing a year-long shamatha retreat if we have done significant practice in those other three areas of training, of the preliminaries, of the cognitive, vipassana practice, and the emotional balance, the four immeasurables. I mean, to contemplate doing a year-long shamatha retreat without having significant training in those three other areas is a recipe for disaster. I think our year-long shamatha retreat will probably last about 1 week, and then we'll run out of there because we don't have the basis for it. We don't have the preparation for it. So therefore, if we want to be able to engage in a year-long shamatha retreat, we would want to have significant practice in all four areas of shamatha, vipassana, compassion, and preliminaries. If we've done that and we have a well-established practice in all four areas, then it may be, and on this point, we wouldn't want to just decide ourselves to do it. We'd probably want to get advice from a qualified teacher, because that may be not the best use of time to go for a 1-year shamatha retreat. But there may be circumstances where that would be the best to do, but you'd want to get advice from a qualified teacher on that one. But if that would be the advice, then in a year-long shamatha retreat, you would not be simply just doing shamatha. That would not go well, I would suggest. You would still, even though during that year, you would maybe your main practice is shamatha, you would still be engaging in those three other areas. You'd still be working on preliminaries, you'd still be working on vipassana, you'd still be working on compassion. Because otherwise, if you drop those and you just do shamatha, again, I would suggest that it's not going to go very well at all. I think you're going to have a lot of difficulties. So therefore, a one-year shamatha retreat can be effective if done with an effective basis at the right time, but we'd still need to support that shamatha with these three areas of practice during that 1-year retreat.
So another question is also something I was wondering myself, how Tantra, Mahamudra, and Dzogchen fits into the daily life recommendations.
Tantra, Mahamudra, and Dzogchen. To be able to practice Tantra, we have to have done all these four areas of practice significantly. I mean, without preliminary practices, without shamatha, without vipassana, without compassion, particularly compassion at an elevated level, what's called bodhicitta, without that at a very substantial level, without having that as a solid basis, entering into tantric practice will not be effective. We'll probably waste our time a lot, and actually we may even get into a lot of trouble with Tantra if we don't have that basis, particularly, all of those areas, but particularly if we don't have that vipassana practice of emptiness. All of Tantra practice is coming out of the wisdom of emptiness. And if we haven't really done a lot of work on that, I think we can get into a lot of trouble in Tantra practice, in Dzogchen and Mahamudra level, Tantra level practice. So all the meditation texts on Tantra say the same thing, basically, that to have an effective basis, we need preliminaries, we need shamatha, we need vipassana practice of emptiness, and the compassion practice of bodhicitta. All of those at a very good level. Without that, then Tantra, we can do a lot of sadhana practice and nature of mind pointing out instructions, but I think they're not going to be very effective, and we could actually get ourselves into a lot of trouble
Yes. Um, so another one, we have actually two more. Do we have time?
Sure. Yeah,
Um,
we can do quickly.
when I tried to think about these three things before going to sleep, I had a bit of a problem to think about the negative action, and I felt like it made me look too much about the negative, which is already so dominant in our life. Do you have any tips for that?
Yeah. So that's why I suggested to also focus on the positive. And but the thing is that often what we do with the negative is, again, we identify with it and we go, I'm a bad person. Whereas here we are not, we're picking up one negative action, but not going, oh, I was such a bad person today, but just acknowledging that bad behavior. So actually, by acknowledging the bad behavior and having regret and so on and that, we're actually shifting from cognitive fusion to a correct perspective of the negative. But you're right, we don't want to focus too much on the negative. So just one, but to shift the perspective from cognitive fusion, I was a bad person today, don't like that. I just did this one. And the bad thing can just be a negative thought. It could be just, we had a negative thought during the day. It's not like we have to think of some huge negative thing. But when we think about it, again, is think about it in the correct way. So that's going to help us to overcome the cognitive fusion. But as I mentioned, and as the question was saying, is we have this obsessive focus on the negative. So even more important than that would be to focus on a positive, rejoice, and strong determination to do it again, and gratitude. So really focus primarily on the positives, but just one little negative, just to start to shift this cognitive fusion that I'm a bad person, just that, I did just this bad thing, and then regret and so forth. Just that will help to shift the way we see those bad behavior. But yes, you're right. Focus a lot on the positives. So one last question, and then we're just about out of time.
All right, so wrapping up with something positive, which kind of meditation should I use to meditate to appreciate thankfulness for all the people that helps me for the moment that I need help? There is meditation for it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, yeah. There is. Uh, I often lead an empathetic joy meditation, and one of those, and it's pretty straightforward to do. It's simple. I'll just explain it here now. Is what we can do is go back on the timeline of our life, right back to when we were a very young child, and try to remember the first time someone did something for us when we were very young. Maybe it was a parent or something, and then have gratitude, rejoice in that they helped me so much, and then move slowly in a whole meditation, move slowly along that timeline of your life from your early childhood years to your years at primary school, at high school, and then into the teenage years, adult years, right up to the present day, and go through that slowly. And then remember all the people who are kind to you in your life, from teachers to friends to colleagues to work colleagues and so forth, mentors, whoever, and see how kind they were to you and helped you in your life, and really be grateful for all that help you received throughout your life. And so that can be very powerful, again, to really focus on the positives, that we receive a lot of things in our life. So that would be a very good meditation to do. Okay, we better leave it there. We've run out of time. So just to complete here, before we run away, let's dedicate not only all of the efforts of today's sessions, but let's dedicate all the things we've done in this whole program, and we'll dedicate it all using, again, this Shantideva dedication prayer. And so again, when I read out the dedication prayer, you might like to reflect on the words. May all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth. Those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. Thank you. So I'd like to finish by thanking Shantideva Study Group for inviting me along to run this program, and all of those of you who in Shantideva Study Group who help support this program as well. And lastly, I'd like to thank all of you who've attended this program. I hope that you got something out of this program, and if you did, then don't just leave it as some nice memory, but use these ideas to integrate them into your life, to develop yourselves, to improve your life, and to help those around you as much as you can. So thank you very much. Hope to see you again sometime in the not too distant future. I think it'll probably be online, but hope to see you again sometime not too distant future.
Thank you, Glen.
Bye now.
Thank you so much, and I hope to see you in Israel next year. You know, we are focusing on the positive side. That's what you said. So hopefully we'll see you then. And thank you so
much. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you, Glen.